Since September 11th, 2001, we've lost over 150,000 veterans to suicide. That's not just a statistic. That's 150,000 brothers and sisters who carried the weight of service only to face their darkest battles alone on home soil. What's even more troubling is the approach we've taken to address this crisis. We're looking at a system that often responds to mental health struggles by prescribing medications that, of all things, can increase the very thoughts we're trying to combat. Think about that for a moment. We're giving our veterans who may already be wrestling with suicidal thoughts medications that list suicidal ideation as a potential side effect. This isn't just counterintuitive. In many cases, it's outright dangerous. The Department of Veterans Affairs just released their 2024 suicide report. And behind the carefully crafted statistics and methodically chosen metrics, these harsh realities remain. Today, we'll hear from veterans working directly in this space who witness these challenges firsthand and are actively seeking solutions. We'll also hear the positions from veteran service organizations who are leading the conversations around this dialogue, and we'll conclude with insights from Congressman Mike Bost, Chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, whose oversight role provides a crucial window into the policy shaping veteran mental health care in the United States. The message could not be clearer. What we are doing is not working. The status quo isn't just failing, it is costing lives. The numbers in this report, however they're presented, represent real people, real families, and real loss. It's time to have the courage to try something different, to be truly honest with ourselves about the care we're providing to our nation's veterans, to explore alternative approaches that treat our veterans as whole human beings, not just collections of symptoms to be medicated. Stay with us as we dive deep into this crucial conversation, because maybe, just maybe, the solution isn't another prescription. It's in having the boldness to chart a new course together. Hey everybody, welcome back to Grunt Style Foundation's Gaslighting the Warfighter podcast. I'm your guest host today, Derek Blumke, Veteran Impact Fellow for the Grunt Style Foundation, and I have co-host Tim Jensen with me today. Mr. Tim Jensen, welcome, sir.
Well, good to see you, Derek. It's great to be with you today. We've got an important subject to be talking about here on Gaslighting the Warfighter, and I couldn't think of a better person to be sharing that time with than you today, the subject matter expert on this particular subject. Hey, Derek, the reason why we've gathered here today is we've got some really dense data that was released right before the Christmas break from the VA, and that was the 2024 VA's annual suicide report. There's a lot of information in this thing, and it was released in two parts. First time they've ever done that before. So what we're going to do today is we're going to get through a lot of this data, a lot of the subject that they talk about within this report, and we're going to challenge a lot of the things that were inside the report itself. We've got some great guests that are going to be joining us today to help us talk about it, to unravel some of the information that is inside of this thing. And we're going to bring some veteran service organizations in to talk about what their opinions are around this subject. So we've got a really great opportunity here to bring in a lot of people that can speak intelligently to this and are doing a lot of work in the space to reduce the numbers, because as the data shows, we're not going backwards, right? We have a lot of work to do. So, Derek, that's why I'm excited about this conversation. I'm excited to share this time with you. And really, let's get into the guests, because we got some really great people that have a lot of information to share.
Absolutely. Today we're joined by Angela Peacock, U.S. Army of Iraq veteran. She is a deprescribing coach and expert, has degrees from Washington University in St. Louis, undergrad and master's in social work, and has been working on the issue of overprescribing and safe deprescribing for about 10 years. And then we have Nick Palmisciano, founder of Ranger Up, Dieseljack Media, and U.S. Army infantry officer veteran.
I was an infantry officer, and when I got out, I had a brief gig in a Fortune 100 company before starting a hobby, Ranger Up, that turned into a full-time job. And in that capacity, that was the first time I really started dealing with veterans in crisis, because, Tim will tell you, people will write on customer service and just kind of let you know that they're in crisis and could you call, or they'll hit you up on social media. And so in the early years of that company, part of like our job was to talk to people that had returned from combat or had gotten out or had major issues. And it became a really important, issue to me. And then, fast forward throughout the years, I'm a founding member of Save Our Allies. We do international refugee work. We, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Ukraine, et cetera. And in Diesel Jack Media, I work with so many organizations that are trying to fight this issue that you realize that there is a path forward. There are solutions, but so much of those solutions are predicated on getting ahead of the problem before it is a problem. And so I'm excited to be here to talk about this with you guys. Super excited to hear, Angie obviously is way more qualified than all of us. Derek, I know that this has been, your life's work in the last 10 years. And I do think, unlike a lot of people, I think it's a solvable problem. And I think we need to get the government to really integrate into these public-private partnerships so that we get the investment necessary to solve this.
So, Angie, pleasure to have you on the program, and we are excited to pick your brain on this subject. You are very close to it, and you've been working in parallel with Derek for a very long time on the subject, the epidemic of suicide within our community. But, with that, there are some new subject terms that are being used inside of the annual suicide report. And I want to get some clarity on that. I think our audience deserves some clarity on it because these terms are new. They don't have any context to it at all, and we're supposed to discern what that really means. So, there's from the report itself, they're talking about a 29% increase in sedative use disorder. What the hell is that?
When that popped up, when I was reading the report, I was like, what do they mean by that? Because what I heard in that, and it's the title of, I think, this episode, is a little gaslighting. And what I mean by that is VA is prescribing benzodiazepines. It's a class of drugs used for anti-anxiety. They are prescribing them at a very high rate. And once they prescribe that and the veteran gets physiologically dependent, which is different from addiction, they're not buying these on the corner, okay? They're getting them from their doctor for anxiety or post-traumatic stress, and then they become dependent on them. Is the VA labeling them as having this addictive disorder? That's a problem. That's a lot of gaslighting. That's an overprescribing problem. And that shows you, or it shows me at least, that they don't have a safe deprescribing program. Instead, they're labeling these veterans addicts. That is irresponsible and very gaslighty to me. And it's definitely stuck out on the report. There was no context. There was no citation to follow. Very vague.
Right. And generally what we would normally see would be a footnote of some sort that's direct you to, hey, this is what we're talking about here. But there's none of that to be seen. And in fact, inside the entire report, both two volumes of this thing, there is no conversation of any sort of relationship between the veteran and the psychotropics that are being administered inside the system, which we know is nearly 70% of those inside the healthcare program right now. This is from the VA itself, are currently being prescribed psychotropics. Why are they obfuscating with this new classification and terminology, in your opinion, and not really just talking about it on its face value?
To me, it's been missing for years. If we're going to talk about suicide prevention, but we leave out the role of medication, that is a problem. It's been a problem for years. It's like, let's look at the socioeconomic impact. Let's look at the means. There was things about firearms and ways that veterans complete suicide, but there's nothing about the medical side, nothing about, this is something our veteran community hasn't talked about much, but the fact that we are paying veterans benefits to go to the doctor to take their meds, and they're scared to stop taking their meds, and if they even wanted to stop their meds, that would threaten their benefits in their minds, that's a problem. It's like a cat chasing its own tail, okay? So there's a lot of different issues here. The other thing that stood out to me was the female veteran number taking that sharp decrease in 1 year. I found that very suspicious. Like, okay, then if you did something so great, what is it? And why didn't it not work for male veterans also? So this data concerns me in multiple levels.
I wanted to chime in at the end of her comment. And it's also interesting that and Derek and I have spoken about this, that they literally in their note sheet say, hey, don't look at any one year as a trend. Don't read too much into this information. And then, right on their takeaway page, the first thing is like, female, suicide rates are way down. Literally the exact same amount as the previous year was up. So,
to your point, right, is like, don't look at our numbers and take it for face value, 1 year statistics, because no changes can be fundamentally done, right? But, the statistical value, we ran that, everybody's connected to AI right now in ChatGPT, right? And this is something that Derek and I were working on, and he ran this equation, right, this probability through ChatGPT, and it came back with a 1 in 15 billion chance that this circumstance would correct itself like it did. So, do they find us as fools? Because, I think some of the smartest people I've ever met wore the uniform of the United States military. And for them to think that they can pass this along to us like we're a bunch of just like low IQ individuals, it's just preposterous. So, Nick, you do a lot of work, within the community. You do a lot of great stuff with the American Legion, and I think the American Legion is doing some really great things when it comes to, firearms unlocking and things of those nature to reduce means reduction, right? But when it comes to like the total, when you got means reduction versus root cause, what is the difference in your mind and your perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's a huge difference, right? So, it's incredibly telling that the numbers of veterans that have not deployed have even higher suicide rates than veterans that have deployed, right? So we have to look at it differently. It's, the people tend to think, oh, somebody experienced some terrible thing in combat and they can't get over it. And while there are cases like that, it's very infrequent. Typically what happens, you get out of the military, you lose purpose. You no longer have a tribe around you. Maybe you're on pain meds for some injury. Maybe you're on psychotropic drugs for depression as a result of not having purpose and tribe when you get out. Maybe you're going through a divorce. Maybe you're drinking too much, because let's face it, we all know that that's something that happened. Most of us have suffered from drinking too much as a result of being in the military. And you stack that on top of all of these other problems, and it creates this kind of like maelstrom of, there's no way out. I can't see a path forward. And any of those factors by themselves are enough. But, there are people that don't have jobs, just went through a divorce, they're on pain meds or they're on psychotropic drugs, and they're like, what's the point? It's also, there's a little bit of it like the scene from First Blood where you're like, in the military, I had all this responsibility. Even if you got out as a team leader or a squad leader, like it's like you were in charge of a lot of people in a very important setting, and now it's like you can't get a job in something you look at and you go, man, I could easily do that. Now, this isn't most people. Veterans significantly outperform all cohorts in compensation, in entrepreneurship, and levels of happiness. But the small group of people that kind of don't, click right away end up in this precarious position.
I want to say something about like our suicide prevention efforts also. When we teach veterans, if you go report suicidal thoughts or behaviors to your medical provider, you're going to lose your rights, you're going to lose your gun rights, we're going to put you in a psych ward and give you meds. That is actually coercive and punitive. So like the veteran learns, stop telling these people that you're suicidal. And the medications have side effects for suicide, especially for young men. It's like it's staring you right in the face. So the question I have to ask after reading both reports, the whole thing, was there's been a rise in suicide. We have not done a good job. So you have to look at the prevention efforts, and all the money VA is spending is not working. It's not. Okay, that's it, bottom line. Rethink the whole thing.
Nick, I'm going to go to you, and then Angie, I'm going to come back to you, because we're going to come back to sedative use disorder and benzodiazepines. But Nick, when we saw each other last at the Student Veterans America's National Conference, we were talking about this issue of overprescribing 68% of all veterans at the VA on a psychiatric drug. another 28% on antidepressants. As Angie mentioned, almost all these medications have a suicide risk profile. The VA, for the past year, we've been meeting with them at all levels, from the secretary on down. They're aware of this issue. They're aware there's a problems with prescribing practices. In fact, there was an OIG report that investigated the death of a veteran that was at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan when the bomb went off. This young man was a student veteran at the University of Alabama. He took his life at 22 years old after being on an antidepressant for a month and a half. What the OIG report came back and said: failure to provide informed consent, failure to provide safe medication management, down the list. But when we were talking, you talked about the impact of the Afghanistan withdrawal and how it impacted veterans, service members alike. Would you share more with us about what you shared with me back just a few weeks ago?
Sure, and it's important. It's important for me to start with, I do not have the physical evidence of this, so this is just me sharing information that was passed on from some whistleblowers on this topic. But folks that were physically present during the Afghanistan withdrawal have seen a significant spike in suicide rates and suicidal ideation. And allegedly, the specific suicide rate amongst Afghanistan veterans since the fall of Kabul has spiked somewhere near 50%. Now, I was told that the report was changed this year into multiple pieces specifically so that it was harder to kind of pull that information out. Now, I can't speak to whether that's true because we don't actually have the real data. Even their data set, which I went through, doesn't have the level of specificity that I would expect. That being said, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that that's the case. So that's deeply concerning, because if you don't understand the problem, if you're not willing to admit the problem, then there is no way to solve the problem.
So when we were talking, you talked about that 50% increase. What aligns with what you just shared is in the 2023 VA suicide report, you can actually a spike in suicides in the months following the withdrawal. And so in last year's report, they actually showed the weekly suicides in a line chart. And so you can see the spikes. And traditionally, annually, you'll see decreases coming through the fall, the winter months, and suicides will generally pick back up in the spring. So this spike was a total outlier with what we should be seeing with suicides of any population, certainly veterans.
Yeah, to be honest, I look at it the same way as I look at 20 years of Afghanistan reporting from general officers. What was in the news every year? We're making progress and we're getting there, and we just need a little more time. And I feel the same way about reporting on suicide prevention. Not from NGOs. NGOs are incredibly honest and tell the government exactly what they need. But from the government, there is a desire to hide the bad news. And I won't pretend I know why. Maybe it's because it hurts recruiting. Parents look at it and say, I don't want my kid to join because look at all these, they have 2 times the suicide rates, of the civilian population. Maybe it's just because for political reasons, like, administrations or, congressmen don't want to take the heat for it. Maybe it's just human nature to say, oh man, we're spending all this money and we're not getting results. But, I know and Tim, like, you can definitely back me up. In life, in entrepreneurship, in relationships, you cannot get to a good place if you don't admit something sucks. Take anything, right? The first grunt style shirt, I am sure sucked, because I know the first Ranger Up shirt did, and we had to iterate and figure out what good looked like. When you start jujitsu, you suck, and it takes reps to figure. So if you continue to pretend like, oh, we're putting these efforts in, well, if the effort isn't getting the result, then you need to be willing to scrap all of it. But the problem is there are people getting paid, there are programs, people run these programs, and nobody wants to admit, like, this isn't working. And I'm not saying that there aren't things that are working, but if the goal is 0, right? If we start at 22 and we get to 5, okay, we're doing something right. But if we start at 22 and we get to 22, and I know that's not exactly the number, but I mean, for a long time, it's basically been the same. So we're not winning. So let's be honest that we're not winning and figure out who's winning in tiny pockets and start replicating what they're doing, and at least be willing to try something new nonstop so that we start winning. That's my problem with it. It's we all know it's bullshit.
Nick, I think the way that you frame that with the analogy of the 20-year war, right, and the reports that we're constantly getting from all the big wigs that said we're winning this thing every day, guys, right, and we got blown that smoke straight up our ass for 20 years to walk away from both Iraq and Afghanistan as warfighters and veterans of that conflict to feel like we've been defeated, and. The challenge with the government when it comes to how they frame this and they're looking at it internally is they have all the money in the world to spend, and there's not a project that they won't throw dollars at, right? But when it comes to them saying root cause analysis and what we're trying to solve, then it's like, we don't want to really get into that game. Let's just jazz hands over here, and we'll talk about, hey, are you guys really locking up those guns? Because we see a lot of you guys taking your life with guns, and that's the real problem, guys. But so it's, I love that analogy, and the only way that we're going to, move this ball further down the field is by having these real conversations of saying, you know what? We've lost confidence in the generals. We've lost confidence in the VA. We don't make these stories up. We don't make the story up that 100 veterans go to the Phoenix VA to get their colonoscopies to walk out with HIV. We don't make those stories up, right? We don't make up the fact that 68% of our community is on psychotropics and suicide is through the roofs, and we find out that a majority of these people taking their lives are on psychotropics. We're not making that stuff up, but they want us to think that we are, and they want to gaslight us, hence the name of this program. But we want to gaslight the warfighter into believing that it's us, that we have some moral conflict injury, and that it will be fine. Just let's talk it out. And here's some psychotropics. You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. And then 4 months later, you've got a barrel of a gun in your mouth, and you take your life. And that's unacceptable.
So, Angie, earlier we talked about sedative use disorder, and the first time ever mention of any psychiatric drug in the suicide reports by the VA, they actually mentioned benzodiazepines, and that is the primary drug that you have with sedative use disorder. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, as a person who was prescribed a benzo within VA for post-traumatic stress, I learned this the hard way, that coming off that class of drugs, you get suicidal thoughts as a withdrawal symptom, first of all. A couple other things. Any benzo exposure to post 9/11 veterans with PTSD or TBI increases their risk of suicide 2.4%. That's VA's own data. Okay. The second part is these guys and gals are getting physiological dependence. They're not being taken off safely. So when they get that suicidal ideation, it's not being recognized as a withdrawal effect. So then the veteran's suicidal again. And it's almost like incompetence to a great degree, that just the VA does not understand how strong these drugs are and you have to safely deprescribe, or you will increase the risk of suicide. It's also contraindicated in PTSD. It makes PTSD worse. It makes the veteran unable to get meaningful therapy to kind of work through their experiences. There's so much wrong with it. The U.S. Army even released a report that said it impacts impulse control. Do not give to active military. Okay, that's their data. I'm not making that up. But the thing that I want to say is that they slid it in there like they know they have a problem, but they're not willing to explain it. And it's almost like kind of sneaky, like the opiate crisis. Like, oh, we have a problem. Oops. But let's blame the veteran for the problem when we are the ones prescribing it.
I totally agree with you. And it's shocking to me because I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert the way that you are. I'll just share something that is tangentially related. My daughter has junior myoclonic epilepsy. So every once in a while she has seizures. And what we have learned, as, parents that have to deal with this issue, is that any time that you're taking a drug that affects the brain, you cannot just start it and stop it. There is a phase in and there is a phase out. And if she if she forgets to take one dose of one of these drugs, one dose, she can have a seizure like that, even after not having seizures for months or even over a year. And so, she has alarms on her phone and the pill case. And so the fact that and she has relatively minor epilepsy relative to what other people have. So the fact that a much less powerful drug, we have to take all of those precautions, and we're thinking about that all the time, and our doctors are telling us about that. But then you have veterans that are starting and stopping things that are literally 100 times stronger. And I know it's not apples to apples, but I have to think that the effect is similar.
Yeah. And I just think if you take a young mind who's been through really traumatic experiences and you go messing with their meds, taking them off, putting them on, putting them in the psych ward because they're suicidal, what do you think good is going to happen out of that? Obviously, it's not good. We're watching it. So there needs to be, this is what I think is the base of the problem. This is all top down. This is VA telling veterans and organizations what to do about suicide. Why don't you listen to the veterans? Listen to the suicidal veterans. Ask them, why are you suicidal? What is going on in your life?
Great. This is a great point, right? It's because this is a strategy, right? Because the way that the VA goes out and buys their medicine, it's a strategy, right? The way that they administer these medicines is a strategy, and that strategy comes down to, I don't know, let's take the position on Trazodone, right? Trazodone has a 62% plus or minus on its counter commercial partner, Ambien, in suicide uptake, right? So if you're taking Trazodone, you have a 62% higher rate of suicide rather than taking Ambien. But the VA doesn't really give you Ambien. It has a great relationship with Trazodone and will give you Trazodone like it's free candy, like it's Pez, right? I was one of those individuals. I was on 250 milligrams of that stuff, and it's zombie stuff. It is a tranquilizer. Right, and this stuff is dangerous, but that is just really the one example of it, and it's a personal example, anecdotal. But to the greater question of it all is, what is the strategy of how we're administrating these drugs to our community? Right? Why do we go through hand the medicine first rather than something different? Because the VA tells us all the time that they're doing all these different alternative modalities, but we still are administering these drugs first thing. Angie, I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
I mean, I've been thinking about this the whole podcast, that we're not going to get rid of psychiatric drugs, okay? And we're not here to say, all drugs are bad in all circumstances, okay? The VA is going to continue to use drugs. But the veterans not being educated about the high chance of suicide, it's a freaking side effect. We're not making that up. It's in the FDA pamphlet. There's research to back that, okay? If veterans are not provided with that information through informed consent, and the VA's deprescribing program is not researched, there is no, it's all up to clinical judgment, okay? So when I saw sedative use disorder, it's a sneaky way of saying, oops, we got these veterans addicted to benzos. And if you read their deprescribing clinical practice guidelines for deprescribing benzos, it's very irresponsible. Okay, so you got to ask yourself, when you see that piece of data, why is there such a high, I think it was 68% of veterans on benzos with that use disorder were having an increase in suicide. You got to ask yourself why. Is it our deprescribing guidelines instead of the veteran? So anyway, I don't think we're going to get rid of drugs. We just need more information. We need less switching. We need prescribers to understand that these are very risky drugs and they alter your brain, mood, and behavior. That's what they do. So then why are we surprised when they do that to a veteran and it ends in a poor way? There's enough evidence out there, okay? There just is.
Yeah, Nick, same question to you. You're a strategist, you're a business owner. What if you were the observer that uses the VA periodically? What is it that you see from a strategy perspective that's just a head scratcher?
Yeah, I think the VA is overworked. And I think that is one root cause. I think that, like you annotated earlier, the VA has relationships with certain drug companies and not other companies. But I think it really just comes back to the fundamental thing is you have to be able to question everything. When you're talking about science, science is the idea that we constantly ask questions, perform tests, and iterate in order to get better and better answers. So nobody is saying that there is no situation where drugs should be prescribed. However, if I walked into a clinic and I told somebody I have suicidal ideation and they gave me a drug that increased my chances of taking my own life by 62%, and that wasn't made clear to me, that is a real problem. Like that, now we're talking about, did you just load the gun? Am I like, hey, I don't want to have this gun because I'm thinking about killing myself. And you're like, well, maybe if you hold it loaded, you'll feel better. Like that's a problem.
Yes, you would. It'll make your life better.
To talk about the Trazodone, as Tim, you brought it up, Angie, you kind of brought more out of that conversation, is what I have a problem with is that the VA has known this. This is the VA's own study that there is a 62% higher suicide attempt rate for those on Trazodone versus Zolpidem or Ambien. The biggest problem I have with this is that I have at a meeting with a senior leader at the VA last year, over a year and a half ago now, and that individual talked about Trazodone and that issue, and that there was 364,000 veterans on Trazodone. And where I have a problem with this is they're aware of this, they know this problem exists, and they're failing to discuss the suicide risk of a medication, which they have studies on, that the VA did, that they're not putting in the annual suicide report.
Yep, I think that's a great point, Derek. And I think the real question that we should be asking the VA and on data that they should be providing us is, hey, all right, we have a prescribing strategy for these medicines. Fantastic. Show us the data on how long these veterans are, or these patients are on these medications. And that will be clear as day what the situation really is.
Well, one more.
When it comes to these SSRIs, it's in and out. That's how they're supposed to be prescribed. But what we're seeing is 3 years of exposure on these things, and that's not how these things are supposed to be going. And I don't know, is there a correlation between overexposure of these things and suicidal ideations?
Quick note, and then I kick to Angie on this. Exactly. So with benzodiazepines, there's a study from the VA showing that those veterans with PTSD who were prescribed a benzodiazepine were prescribed for, I think 73% of them were prescribed them for more than a month at a time. That's not supposed to happen. I'm meeting veterans who have been on benzos prescribed by the VA for years. In 2025, in a time when we already know these drugs have major dependency and withdrawal issues. So Angie, could you talk a little more about that?
Well, in 2019, I did a VFW SVA fellowship on benzos and polypharmacy in the post 9/11 generation. And I pulled data from VA mental health, and there was 8 million prescriptions for the year of 2019 that were over 30-day prescriptions. That's not 8 million veterans. That's like repeated 30-day prescriptions. Okay. So they have the data. The other piece of data I'd like to see that Tim hinted at, look at their deprescribing program, follow those veterans out. What were the outcomes of these prescriptions and the way, like what happened to these veterans that are being prescribed these meds? Look at the healthcare utilization. We have the best database in the world.
Right.
Watch these veterans over time, because listen, Tim, like you said before we got on, we are war fighters. We are the smartest, fastest, most creative people on the planet, and you're making everybody mentally ill and killing themselves. What the fuck is going on?
That's also the data that I
want
would
to see it. Follow these veterans over their lifetime. Show me.
Yeah, you've prescribed this. Has this improved outcomes, or have the outcomes become worse? And again, this is where, like, I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, but this is where I do start questioning, money. I mean, because if there's an organization I do not trust, it's Big Pharma. It is, the desire to make money off of these drugs without really having to prove over time that there's efficacy. Not that it's not dangerous on whatever scale the FDA has, but just that you're actually solving the problem. Because if the problem isn't being solved, then why increase the risk factor? And I suspect, based on the fact that, suicide numbers have not decreased, that we are not actually solving the problem with any of these drugs.
It's funny you talk about efficacy, because you look back at 1988 and 1991 when Prozac and Zoloft were approved for market respectively. The FDA has a committee that comes together and discusses whether the drugs are safe and supposed to be effective. That's a primary supposed to be the measure. The entire debate throughout all these hearings was efficacy. The drug companies can submit as many studies as they want that they conducted themselves, but they just need to have 2 that show some level of efficacy. And so that's what they got, was a couple studies that barely showed efficacy. Would it surprise you at all that it was a VA psychiatrist that chaired those hearings and then also chaired what we now look back and call the 1991 Prozac hearings?
So, we got a lot of horrific stories that were coming from that conversation. Women, mothers killing their families, their children. Some really gut-wrenching stuff that moved the needle nowhere in the grand conversation at all. In fact, what we end up learning were the people on that board were representative and lobbyists of big pharma, right? So we weren't even having a real conversation. We were having a spectacle of subject matter experts that like to go around and parade, their data around and make us all look like we're stupid because they're driving a bottom line or a contract relationship with their end user. So, it's a farce. This whole conversation is a farce. The last 60 years of this conversation has been a farce. But we sit here and we wonder why the numbers continue to grow. We wonder why there's school shootings that are happening all over the country. We can tie these medications to those as well. Like, why are we still doing this? And at what point is life too sacred to say we're not going to do it anymore, or we're going to find better ways of applying this stuff? Because to Angie's point, and to I think everybody on this panel, is that this medication has its usefulness in controlled, applied situations. But when it's left to run rampant, then we look around the community and wonder why everything's on fire, and then we're sitting here with a match in the other hand. So you can't be both ways.
Angie, I'm going to ask you a question coming off of what Tim just shared. Would you mind sharing how many medications these folks had you on?
Yeah, I was prescribed more than 40 psychiatric drugs in 13 years. And at the height, I was on 18 at the same time. And you might think that is wild. No, it's absolutely true. It's in my VA record. I also had 7 hospitalizations, like 4 suicide attempts. So I've lived this, okay? And I didn't know. All of this stuff that I'm having, now I have really bad anxiety. Now I have really bad depression. Okay, here's more meds. Turned into polypharmacy nightmare. Polypharmacy is a huge problem in VA. They don't study drugs in combination over the long term. Nobody knows what that does. Okay, so the point I wanted to make listening to Tim was there's micro gaslighting and macro gaslighting here. The micro is, it's in the research that these drugs can increase suicide risk for young people. Okay, I don't think drugs are smart and they stop at age 24. Okay, they just don't work like that. They can make anybody suicidal anytime. I experienced it myself. Secondly, so if the veteran starts getting suicide ideation, now they're put on other meds, they're told they're mentally ill, this is depression forming, this is your post-traumatic stress, whatever. That's happening. The drug is worsening the veteran's condition. Then you have the macro gaslighting with, we're going to ignore the meds that even exist or have anything to do with our suicide prevention efforts. These are just a group of mentally ill veterans. That's what's happening. They're just suicidal because of what they've been through. You see what I'm saying? How slick it is? Like, we can just blame the veteran for everything, blame their mental illness for everything. We don't have to take responsibility for what we are treating them with. That's bullshit. It's in their research.
Yeah. I'll one of the impetuses of this conversation, right, and where it began on my side was a few years back. My one of my dear friends that I went to Iraq with, went to the VA, and I've shared this story with a lot of people. Went to the VA for smoking cessation because they market smoking cessation, right? But because of the lack of informed consent and the conversation that was being had, or that should have been had, I'm like, hey, we're going to give you Wellbutrin because that's what we're administering for smoking cessation. It has these great principles and properties to make you quit smoking. But we're not going to talk to you about all the other psychomeds that you're on and the interactions that happen there. And within 4 months, my friend killed himself in the house of his family, with his family upstairs. That is unacceptable. Like this man was a businessman in the city of Chicago, had an incredible business, family, well set, and had no mental health issues that were just what you would normally find amongst the rank and file. He went there for smoking cessation and was put on these medicines and ended up killing himself. So this is the danger that we're talking about. It could be something as simple as going in for smoking cessation and you get access or exposure to this, or it could be that, hey, I'm going to the VA because I need some real help because I'm losing control of my faculties and my agency, and I need those conversations, and I need that exposure. So it can happen all in between, and that's really the dangers of this and why we need to have this more robust conversation. So the hopes of what we're doing here with this programming is to get it more comfortable that we can have these conversations in groups and have a bigger conversation on the national level so that we can influence change. And that's what really we all have a responsibility of doing.
Thanks, Tim. So, Angie, you talked about how many medications you'd been prescribed at a single time, 18, which is absolutely absurd and insane for anyone listening to this. So the VA has a polypharmacy dashboard internally. So they actually are tracking and flagging when veterans are on these big drug cocktails. So they're actually seeing this. Nick, how do you feel knowing that the VA has an internal dashboard, knowing that they know there's an increased risk for negative outcomes for people on multiple drugs at a time, polypharma is what they call it, and it's not appearing in the suicide report?
Yeah, I have major concerns with that. And I am not a person that thinks that the rank and file at the VA are trying to do anything other than a good job. I think, there are definitely terrible folks at the VA, just like there are terrible folks everywhere. But I think most people are at the VA because they're trying to help veterans. That being said, when it comes time to report, managers, have a tendency to not want to take any heat or not want to be responsible for outcomes. It's much easier to just be like, veterans have this problem, as opposed to self-assessment. Nobody wants to admit, maybe this woman took their life because of something we prescribed. But I'll tell you what, identifying that in year one, making that public, making sure it's very clear that this is a risk, maybe saves lives in years 2 through infinity. And that is what the expectation should be of our services. Not that people aren't going to make mistakes, not that we aren't going to identify things that are problematic. That's medicine by nature. There are things that they used to prescribe cocaine. You know what I'm saying? So it's not like anybody's saying, that we can't be wrong. But when we're wrong and you keep doing it, now it's on you. Now you are complicit in ruining people's lives. And, to the title of this thing, now you're gaslighting people into thinking that it is on them when it's really on you. And that's a problem.
Tim, do you feel like this report is telling a story that we're actually learning something from?
With the benefit of my exposure of working in the Pact Act and working with the VA and legislators on Capitol Hill, I think it's just more of the same. I think it's obfuscation. It's the jazz hands of, hey, we know there's a problem, but we're going to point you over here on some things that is going to give us a little bit more time, and we're not going to really talk about the big things, right? And to everything that what Nick had just pointed out, it's all we are asking is can we just be honest with each other and say, yes, there's a problem? Because once we identify the problem, we can start changing the problem. And I think that again, it's more of the same. Since these reports started coming out, right? It's obfuscation of the data, jazz hands, look over here, and we're going to continue, guys. We promise that this is an initiative. We're going to spend millions and millions of your tax dollars on this to make sure we get it right. Well, the insanity has to stop, And it has to stop here by just the way that we are looking at the data. And if we can just change that, right, and maybe get some informed consent pushed through the VA, that's change right off the get. And we can make some substantial movement off of that, because in the war of attrition, right, which that's what we are stuck in right now, we are fighting for inches. And, I don't have any more inches to give when my buddies and my friends are dying and they're taking their lives, just like they did with the Pact Act. I don't have any more time. We don't have any more time. And we can use our resources to do better and put the pressure where the pressure needs to be, and just have honest conversations with those people that are in the positions to make those change. So that's what I think is happening. That's why I think that we can go and we can use these conversations and platforms all across the veteran community to leverage that to make the change that is necessary. That's how we do this. That's how we got the Pact Act done, by bringing all these people to the conversation and leveraging that strength and say, we're in charge of our own healthcare. You're not going to dictate to us what that is. This is our facility. This is for veterans. This is our healthcare. Let's take control of that.
I'd like to ask all of you, we have the confirmation hearing coming up for former Congressman Doug Collins to be the VA secretary. It's supposed to be on the 14th. Now it's pushed back to the 21st. If there was a message to the incoming VA secretary, what would that message be? And we'll start with Angie, if you would.
My message to the incoming secretary would be that VA needs an overhaul of the suicide prevention program, starting from the ground up. Number one, listen to veterans. Ask them what is going on in their lives, in their treatment choices, everything that we can find about their suicide risk and just what's going on. Also, I'd like to see the legislation passed from Senator McCain back from 2016 about a 5-year forensic examination of all veterans who have died and why. Go back and look, what treatment did they get? What treatment did they not get? Let's find some data. We have money for that. Then I would like to see veterans being informed by teaching them how to read the pamphlet of the drugs that they are taking and giving them choice. There is other choices besides medications for post-traumatic stress and TBI. There are thousands of other treatments. That would be my top 3 priorities.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Angie. Nick?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot simpler. It is the idea that as the VA secretary, which I think is one of the most important secretary positions, he should be coming into this with the idea that honesty and iteration and assessment are at the top of the list. What is working? What is not working? And do not try to protect what is not working in order to keep funding for certain areas, help certain lobbies, not make certain congressmen look bad. I'm sure there's all kinds of pressures that we can't comprehend coming into these secretary positions. But if somebody was like, Nick, this is your job, my entire goal would be, what is the ground truth of what we're doing? Because in any organization, if you don't truthfully assess what is good, what is bad, you cannot improve. What do we do at the end of every military exercise? We do an AAR, right? An after action review. What is it that we did well? What is it that we did poorly? And what I keep seeing coming out of the VA is we've done these things well and no discussion of what they've done poorly. That's impossible because I've been an entrepreneur for a long time. Every day I screw something up and have to self-assess or have to talk through it with, my teams and get better. So it is impossible that in an organization as important, as large as the VA, that there are not issues of concern. And it is worrisome to me that these issues are never really public. It's always the VA defending themselves from criticism. And I get that. I understand that these people are working very hard and that we are probably unrealistic in our expectations of what any organization can do. That being said, it would be much easier for me to stomach some of these defenses if it was like, hey, we did screw this up. And here are the steps we've taken to fix this. but doing that before a spotlight is shined on it from thousands of veterans applying pressure and Jon Stewart. And, it should not be that. It should be the organization should always be trying to self-assess and improve publicly. And I've never seen that from the VA. And to me, that is the thing that I think would drive success by that organization faster than anything else.
Thanks, Nick. So, Tim, we met with VA Secretary McDonough back in March. We outlined a series of requests, signatory informed consent, basically have real conversations between the patient and the doctor on what the risks and efficacy of the medications or treatments they're being prescribed or given are going to be. Retraining of the entire VA mental health workforce, prescribers, mental health clinicians on the risks and efficacy of medications. Reform deprescribing guidelines, because we know, as Angie mentioned, we're getting folks off these drugs too quickly after they've been on them long periods of time. What other message would you like to send the incoming VA Secretary, Doug Collins?
Yeah, absolutely. First I want to say, thank you to Angie and Nick for joining us on this really, really important conversation. I can't think of two better individuals to share this platform with to talk about these important subjects, right? These are real things that, it's not the fancy stuff, it's not the funny stuff, but it's the important stuff. And, when it comes to Doug Collins, and I think what we have the momentum going forward, right, is that he should continue to build off of what McDonough has put together. I am a big fan of McDonough. I think that he has done an incredible job of trying to wrangle this thing that is the VA together in ways that, other secretaries have not done in the years. And that's not to speak badly of any of those secretaries. That's a monumentally difficult job.
It's a huge organization.
It's huge, right? And it's the largest healthcare system in all of America. So, with that being said, Mr. Collins, Honorable Doug Collins, I would say, take what he has done there and continue to build on that success. Learn, to Nick's point, right? You're a former military individual, as I understand it myself, yourself. So, do the AAR of what worked and what hasn't worked under McDonough's leadership. And, the second thing I would say is get into the trenches with the veterans that are fighting for their own work and their own health, right? There are so many great organizations that are on the ground doing so many great things. Listen to them. They're the experts because they are addressing the problem at ground level. They're not addressing it from, an office, on Saks Avenue. They're not addressing it from a data center in, Phoenix. They're doing it on the ground, and they're addressing those needs in ways that are faster than the government can ever do. And you should listen to those people, bring them in, because they have a mountain of experience and knowledge that could help you, sir, make a better decision on the direction that we need to take this thing. And there is a lot of support. There are a lot of people eager to give that hand. That would be my message.
Thanks a lot, Tim. So, Angie, Nick, we can't thank you both enough. Tim and I are honored to have you both with us today. We're having these really great conversations, really looking at this issue, talking about things the rest of the community really isn't addressing. I mean, I still find it fascinating that a foundation that's a spinoff of a t-shirt company is the lead organization talking about addressing this. But I'm just glad this conversation is being had and proud to be part of it. So thank you both for joining us today. We're excited to be working with you going forward and proud to be partners and friends in this fight to make sure our friends get to live the successful and happy lives that they deserve. So thank you both.
Thanks for having
Thanks for having us.
When we return, we're going to be joined by our nation's largest national veterans organizations, addressing the critical issue of veteran overprescribing and the role of medications in veteran suicides. We'll be joined by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, the DAV. Stay with us.
Grunstyle Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving and supporting America's military community. With a focus on veteran and active duty service members, the Grunstyle Foundation provides resources for mental and physical wellness, food insecurities, transition and sustainment, and veteran homelessness. Join Grunstyle in their mission to give back to those who sacrifice so much for our country. Visit their website today at grunstylefoundation.org to ensure no veteran is left behind.
Welcome back to Gaslighting the Warfighter podcast, the Grunt Style Foundation's podcast that looks at the issues facing the veteran community that not everybody always wants to look at. So here we are today with my co-host Tim Jensen, co-owner of Grunt Style LLC and the board chairman of the Grunt Style Foundation. Also with us today is Cole Lyle, Director of Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation of the American Legion. He's a United States Marine Corps veteran. We have Naomi Mathis, Deputy Director of the DAV's National Legislative Service, also an Air Force veteran like myself. Thank you for joining us, Naomi. And also with us today is Patrick Murray, another Marine Corps veteran. He is the National Legislative Director of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Thank you all for joining us today. So Tim, we're going to go ahead and start this conversation off because here today we have some of the most influential, largest national veterans organizations in America, and we're talking about this issue of the Veterans Annual Suicide Report. And we're also looking at the lens through which several of the national veterans organizations have resolutions on the books that call for a series of actions ranging from signatory informed consent, reform deprescribing guidelines, and even just basic data dumps from the VA on what's going on with prescription rates, suicides, toxicology reports, and others. So I'm going to start this conversation off with Naomi. You and I kind of bonded and kind of clicked when we started talking about our own personal experiences, and you've been very open and forthright with what you've experienced in your life and your career. We kind of like to start the conversation with you, share kind of your personal experience and look at this issue, and then kind of go from there, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. First, thank you for having me. A little bit about me. As you stated, I am an Air Force veteran. I was in Iraq in 2003, and won't go through the whole history, but subsequently was diagnosed with PTSD due to combat. And so once I was diagnosed, of course, I was going through therapy, but had, tons of medication thrown at me, including antipsychotics, to the point where I was almost really catatonic. And was unable to take care of my children. And I was a single parent. I also had other things going on with me. I just had a child, so I had some hormone issues. And possibly, we believe now, it could have been some postpartum depression, as well as dealing with my symptoms of PTSD. Again, was thrown all these different medications and put on different cocktails and all of the things. And still to this day, I do also still take a cocktail of medications, but significantly less than what I had previously been on. And I kind of had to be my own advocate and do my own research on a lot of this. As we were talking yesterday, I happened to be at the pharmacy at VA. It kind of just happened that way. And, you and I got into a really good discussion about really understanding the medications that you're being prescribed and really having, knowing what comes out of that, what comes after that, what to expect.
You and I both had similar experiences in this regard, and it's hard talking about, but I think what you just kind of said, where you talked about you had to become your own advocate. How do you feel that's a challenge when here you are, the National Deputy Legislative Director of the DAV, unarguably one of the largest, most influential veterans organizations in America, and you're helping to lead the national legislative efforts for that organization. What does that say to the veterans out there that are going through similar experiences?
In our resolution, we call for really the veteran to be informed in the non-pharmaceutical alternative treatments, that the options that could be available to treat like chronic illnesses and pain and so forth. It's a lot of information, first of all, for that's coming at the veteran at once, or it's coming at the patient at once. It's medication that potentially they're about to be on. They don't really understand, like I said, the implications of all of that. They don't even understand the diagnosis that they had at the time that I really was diagnosed. I didn't understand what PTSD was. I didn't know that was a thing, and I definitely didn't know that other people were feeling the exact same things I was, or going through the same experiences that I was going through. It's a lot to really understand. It's a lot on the family. And I really, yes, my body and, is mine. Nobody knows it really better than me. However, the practitioners, also kind of are the experts, right? That's why we go to them. That's why we go to the doctors. And so I think it just would really help if maybe some more information went along with what we're being given. And I think our membership also feels that way. I don't think, and they have said so in the form of this resolution, which is that the healthcare practitioners do provide clear and concise information on the conditions, on their diagnoses, as well as on the medications.
Informed signatory consent is a very, very important subject for us at the Grunstyle Foundation, for you guys, for all of the veteran service organizations that are joining us for this conversation. Is legislative action of some sort among the topics that these members are sharing with their leadership as what is important for us. I think as we are looking at some of the information that that's coming to the surface now, when specifically around suicides, around these mental health medicines, we are learning that nearly 70% of the community is being administered these medicines. And there is a significant increase within the female community of these medicines and their administration. But the VA report is showing us a decrease this year in suicides by 24.1% of within the female demographic. Now, I don't know if there's a causation and correlation there that speaks to that, but there's nothing that really speaks to any of the data that you can really put your finger on and say, well, okay, we're seeing success here. I'd love to hear your opinion on, specifically the administration of these psychotropics for females and the increase that we've seen within the last 10 years. I think that's extraordinarily important.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is extremely important when it comes to women. We have a whole reproductive life cycle that happens with us. And, if you have, as I stated, I was going through, I was already diagnosed PTSD. I was already going through those symptoms. And then I had a baby. We didn't know if I was postpartum. And looking back 20 years later, it looks like, yes, in fact, I was. But you're throwing all of these things you're throwing these medications at these symptoms. And some of them don't necessarily need medication. So in, these suicide numbers, I will say something that I also found quite interesting was that the number of women veterans that were taking hormone replacement therapy, it seemed like that number of suicides had gone down. So that was a little interesting to me as well. There are other factors when it comes to women that really should go into a decision on whether or not you give her her a medication, and because I went through menopause at 34 years old, and that's because of a hysterectomy that was needed while I was on active duty, and so. And actually, studies show that women veterans and active duty members do go through menopause at younger ages. If that's the case, and you have a woman that presents that is having all of these issues, your general practitioner may not be able to pick up on some of those, which is why it is also so important for practitioners to have competency in treating veterans and treating military members. And so I think that that is something that is not really spoken about a whole lot, and that's the whole menopause issue. And we think of it as a geriatric issue, and that's not really necessarily true.
Cool. Some of the things that we have learned inside of the report were some new terms and text and terminology in the previous episode on some of those things. And I would love to hear your perspective and understanding of what does evidence-based therapies, what is that? Like, that's new lexicon that we're being introduced to. I'd love to hear your opinion.
Yeah, Tim, thanks for the question. And obviously, thanks for hosting me and everybody on the call here. Evidence-based treatment and therapy is traditionally known as psychological and pharmacological approaches to mental health and suicide prevention. So think prolonged exposure, EDMR, think obviously, pills, SSRIs, benzodiazepines, things like that. So that is and has been the traditional approach, in my opinion, very reactionary. We're asking people to seek counseling, call the VCL, get prescribed medication for symptoms of issues that already exist. We're not being very proactive. And I think one of the biggest takeaways, not only from this report, but from previous years' reports and the trend lines of the veteran suicide epidemic, is that our traditional approaches are not working. When you go to the VA's own website, for the PTSD analysis matrix on where you can submit like what issues you're having and kind of what are the best approaches, under their guidance for you, they say that pharmacology has a complete remission of symptoms of about 30% of the time. It doesn't obviously mention the negative side effects of some of that medication that we all are aware of. And then also that psychological approaches work roughly about 50% of the time. And they will make the argument that if you combine those two things, the success rate is higher. But objectively, number one, I don't think those data points by any measure would be defined as success. But if you look at the outcomes according to the data, and we could have a whole other conversation about the data, I don't think anybody could look at that and say, we have made headway with this issue and with this problem. So, a lot of the people that work at VA, all dedicated people that do want to address this problem, I think has spent years of their lives and hundreds of thousands of dollars going through medical school, doing, VA-funded research, things like that, and have learned these evidence-based approaches to this problem, and are reticent to say that the approaches that they've used and have learned and have practiced throughout the years are failing and not working. And I think that's an institutional cultural shift that really needs to happen. And that's why, the VA is like a very large ship with a very small rudder. It takes a long time to change it in any one direction. And in a vertically integrated healthcare system, fully integrated healthcare system, you don't necessarily want changes to happen super quickly because people's lives and health hangs in the balance. But we do need more aggressive approaches from VA on this issue through alternative therapies, alternative treatments, more holistic things, partnerships with local organizations.
And that was the question I was going to get to next. Is that leads me to believe that the VA is getting prepared for alternative-based therapies. If they're changing the way that they're identifying this really, are they preparing for that? And does that really open up a whole different conversation? That to your point, and what we're all arguing, like ringing the bell on, is like the methods today are not working. Is Is the alternative modalities something that's on the future? Is that on the horizon?
Yeah, I think in instances where the VA has embraced certain alternative methods of treatment for mental health and suicide prevention, I got into veteran advocacy because I had my own issues with post-traumatic stress. I was on a cocktail of medications that I believe ultimately the side effects led me to almost become a statistic one night. I stopped taking the pills and ultimately ended up getting a service dog. When I moved up to Washington, D.C., through a series of events, I decided that, I wanted that option to be accessible to other veterans in larger quantities. And eventually lobbied kind of on my own, not on behalf of any organization, for a bill to try to expand access to service dogs for post-traumatic stress, TBI, and the VA institutionally, they fall back on there's not enough research and there's not enough evidence to prove that this is a viable option, viable solution. So when VA ultimately the bill passed and it was a pilot program, and in some instances where you see these changes, it's because there is a small group of dedicated people who believe in that particular option, really shoe leather lobbying on Capitol Hill to try to get the VA to force them to accept that change. Because typically what you see whenever they want to kind of slow roll this is, okay, there's not enough research, there's not enough evidence to prove that this works. Okay, well, fine, then go research it, right? But you have to go through the whole rigmarole of the legislative process and then the regulatory implementation process to make sure that they're doing what Congress intended to do in the law that was passed. And I think on some things, the Overton window, we're starting to see psychedelics be a more accepted modality. I still don't think we're quite there yet, but as more veterans have been elected to positions and been appointed and seated on the House Veterans Affairs Committee and the MILCON VA appropriation subcommittees, I think you see people who have lived this problem that now are allies to the VSO community and can really, really make the case. So I think we're starting to see that change.
Cole, we talked about kind of the report. We talked about alternative therapies. One thing we didn't see in the report was anything about service animals. We also talked about not seeing some issues related to medications, prescribing. This year's report, for the first time ever, the VA actually talked about benzodiazepines for its first time, but it was for the use of sedative use disorder, and talking about a 29% increase in veterans with sedative use disorder. They don't talk about the VA's actively been trying to get folks off of benzodiazepines for the past 15 years or so. And as they're doing that, you're seeing folks really struggling because it's not an addiction necessarily, it's more of dependence. You get trapped on some of these medications. So could you talk about kind of what you saw in the report or what you didn't see?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what I don't see in the report is an acknowledgement of a couple of different things. One, that the data itself is incomplete, and I don't think we have a full idea of the scope and scale of this problem, because the data is collected through the CDC, which in turn gets their data from states, which in turn get their data from local and county municipalities. And there's often not a ability for local and county coroners to be able to verify somebody's service. A lot of times people that have liver failure because they are self-medicating or die by drug overdose, right, are not necessarily counted as suicides. So I think that's the biggest gap in understanding this problem is a lack of real quality data. But I think also when you look at things like I think they said that the highest rate of suicide for transitioning service members was in the Marine Corps at 67, almost 68 per 100,000, right? I think Navy was next up. They have that data, but they don't necessarily talk about what that data may imply and why transition from the organizations that have a super close kind of ethos and identity, right? How it is harder for those people transitioning to find a new identity, right? We talk a lot in this report about the raw data itself, and we talk a lot about lethal means. We talk a lot about different demographics, but there's really a lack of critical analysis of what some of the upstream factors are that contribute to people making this choice and getting to that critical mass of despair. With regards to medication, obviously you alluded to benzodiazepines. They said there was almost a 30% increase in people using benzos that had killed themselves. And also you alluded to the fact that, when people are, I think we saw this in the opioid epidemic, right? When there's focus on reducing opioids, right, it leads to more issues with chronic pain, which is one of the main contributors to national suicide and veteran suicide, right? So when you focus on this stuff and you start taking these things away, you look at people that turn to self-medication to solve the same problem. So that's a tricky situation to try to address. What caught my eye, the biggest thing when I was briefed, a lot of us were briefed, was the analysis of people that use VA care and people that use community care. The VA has said repeatedly in the past that people that use VA are less likely to kill themselves, right, than people who aren't. This was the first year that they admitted that people that use VA and use community care actually have a higher rate of suicide than people that don't, per the data in the hundreds of thousands. So that was shocking to me that they admitted that openly. And when asked about it, they said, well, people that engage with VA and community care obviously have other issues that they are dealing with that make suicide prevention more complicated, which on its face, I think makes sense. However, that is a large assumption that people that don't use VA don't also have issues that they deal with as a part of their everyday life. So there's a lot in this report that is not included, and some of the things that are included just lead to more questions.
That's interesting. So in 2019, I co-published an article or report kind of detailing what's going on with veteran suicides. And I showed there's a 32% higher suicide rate for those who use the VHA for their health care than veterans who don't. And now we're seeing higher suicide rates for vets who use community care versus VHA care. And then again, lowest suicide rates is down to the folks who are not using VA care at all in any way, shape, or form. I got the same answer when we were first talking about this because they said the same thing, and I'm going to paraphrase: veterans who use the VA are a higher needs population, but crazier, drunker, sicker is kind of what the message was. And the reality is that it may just be that we have better access to care. And actually, I would argue the VA over the past several years has been making changes in policies internally that make prescribing safer. And as we're putting folks out into community care, we may be seeing those higher suicide rates because those external doctors who the veteran now has better access to care through doesn't have those same protocols. But I'm going to pivot over to Pat, because as you were talking, Cole, you mentioned the 68 per 100,000 suicide rate for Marine Corps veterans who were recently transitioned. I'm not sure this is widely known, but there's a study that was done by a joint VA researcher out of Columbia University that showed that there's a 37 to 43% prescription rate for service members in their last year prior to discharge. The VFW, American Legion, DAV, pretty much all the major national veterans organizations all have resolutions on the books now calling for signatory informed consent because we know that patients aren't being told the risks. Pat, would you mind talking about kind of what you see as concerns in the report and how the VFW's resolutions might help make an impact in driving the change that we need to see within our community?
Sure. So, our resolutions mostly about information. Both Cole and Naomi touched on that. I feel one of VA's strongest ability is to be a repository of every bit of data we can possibly imagine, right? They have as much data, right? Cole mentioned some of the difficulties of getting some of that from the local folks, but ultimately, we got to do better at that, but ultimately get it up to VA so they can be the one that's pushing out all this information so we're better informed about this. There's been exponential increases in spending on suicide prevention, but it hasn't moved the needle. So we're spending it in the wrong places. What we want to learn about is like where we need to focus those efforts. In the report, there were, I think it was, let me just do the quick math here. It was 20 some pages of veterans and VHA related data, right? Some of the community care stuff, some of the recent encounters. There's 2 pages of data about the benefits. What we're really trying to do with not just our resolutions, but our focus is try to make this kind of we talk about a holistic approach. It's not just the last time you sat, on a mental health professional's couch and talked to them or got a pill. There's so much more to this. What we've learned is that, veterans who have a roof over their head, they're gainfully employed, they have food on their table, they have money in their wallet, are less likely to die by suicide. And that's where VBA comes in. All those great benefits like, the GI Bill, the home loan, disability compensation, things that help you economically. So that's what we really want to focus on and not just make this a mental health conversation. It's a key component of it, but it is just a component of it. So that's what we're really trying to do. We've been pushing for more information. There was a very small table in there that had, I think, 4 categories, statistics. We want to see more of that. We want to know is, for example, the VR&E program, a buffer against some of these negative outcomes. We want to know, does the GI Bill really launch people forward for success? I mean, some of it we know for other purposes, but does it also have an ancillary protective factor against whether it's suicide, homelessness, unemployment, things like that? So, our focus is this small piece of the pie. Learning more about VBA data is not going to end, this whole problem, but it'll help us maybe focus. It'll help us know where we need to spend that money. Congress and previous administrations have shown they're willing to spend, but we got to spend it smartly. We do live in a world of finite resources, so let's stop throwing money at things that just aren't really moving a needle. That's what we're really trying to focus on. Our resolutions focus on informed consent, right? Black box, issues, things like that. We want to make sure that we also have information about that as well. Which particular, pharmaceutical things are, possibly leading to some of these negative outcomes. We just want more information. I don't know if anybody ever says, more information is a bad thing. But when VA just kind of reverts back to, it's a mental health thing, it puts all that other stuff aside. And we want to kind of knock that out so that we don't continue going down that same path, doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results.
The amount of money that's gone towards this over the past decade is about $10 billion. Fact check me, guys. It's either $1 billion or it's $10 billion. I think it's $10 billion.
So it depends on how you talk about the amount of money that goes to suicide prevention, right? Because structurally, the VA, the Office of Suicide Prevention is housed in the VHA, in the Office of Mental Health, right? So institutionally, they look at this problem as a mental health problem, which is why evidence-based therapy is their traditional modalities to solve the problem, right? Less than 50% of veterans are enrolled in VHA healthcare, maybe right around 50%. Even less use the VA on a recurring basis, right? And there are probably a bunch of different reasons veterans don't use VA. They may have private health insurance, TRICARE, any different distrust of the VA may be a factor. But like, what are you doing if you want to be holistic about your approach to this, you have to have effective outreach to veterans, right? And the VA's budget for suicide prevention outreach specifically is roughly, I think, $570 million per year, which is less than 1/10 of 1% of their entire budget. And And most of that outreach goes to the Veteran Crisis Line. Some of it goes to a program called under the Commander John Scott Hannon Act. There was a Staff Sergeant Parker Gordon Fox grant program that provides up to $750,000 a year for local organizations doing suicide prevention, which I think is a good approach because you have local organizations on the ground that are not, veterans won't necessarily directly associate them with VA, but they're doing the work. They have the trust of local veterans, which is also in line with the VA over the years, getting closer and closer to the community outside of medical centers, CBOCs, vet centers, that sort of stuff. I've never met a veteran that said, "Oh, I saw a Choose VA advertisement at a hockey game," or something like that, and that's what made me decide to go use VA or call the Veteran Crisis Line or something like that. I think to Pat's point, a more targeted approach to effectively reach veterans where they live is crucial in an environment where less than half even use the VA itself or engaged and enrolled in VA healthcare. So that's a huge thing. When we talk about budget, oftentimes when you say, "Hey, how much have we allocated for suicide prevention?" the VA will point to the $13 billion budget for mental health, and you're like, "Okay, but that's not necessarily all suicide prevention." Like we all know here, it's pretty intuitive that when somebody gets to that point, it's usually a conglomeration of financial issues, relationship issues, identity issues. Mental health certainly can play a factor and make somebody more susceptible to going down that path, but it is very rarely I've seen just, "Oh my gosh, I'm having horrible flashbacks or anxiety attacks or things like that," and that's why you decide to go down that path. So again, institutionally, we need to be more proactive, less reactive, and the money needs to reflect that.
Veterans who use the VBA benefits alone have lower suicide rates than veterans who use the VBA and the VHA, and also has lower suicide rates than veterans who use just the VHA. Do you have any ideas or kind of like looking at that issue through this lens, like what may be going on there?
So, one of the things that we do know that some of these programs can be incredibly uplifting. We've talked about in the past, a lot of folks have proclaimed that, the GI Bill built the middle class after, World War II. It offered, the tuition assistance. It offered the home loan. It is a small business grant. It was all kind of lumped in. It was a fantastic program when it was first kicked off in 1944. It largely helped veterans readjust, but it was a lot of economic, powerful tools that were part of it. We've continued on. We've grown and increased the GI Bill to what it is now today. The home loan is maybe one of the most economically important VA benefits that far too many veterans don't use. So anybody listening out there, if you're not using the VA home loan, please take a look at that. It's an incredible program. It can really set you up for success. Cole touched on it, right? He said that the mental health is one part of it that could exacerbate some of those other things that are weighing someone down, whether it's relationship, whether it's economic issues, financial issues, things like that. We got to focus on that because their numbers, even as flawed, as the VA suicide report does show that there's maybe something that we can focus on, and it's VBA benefits. I can't necessarily say why VBA only seems to be a lower statistical number. VHA only is higher, but VBA and VHA seem that they should not be those numbers don't completely jive, but it does show that maybe there's something that we can begin to chip away at this if we can focus on some of those other stressors that go on with a veteran who is struggling.
One of the questions I'd love for our listeners to start wrestling to the ground is how do we make change? What are the instruments? What are the solutions that are at our disposal that we can start soliciting the people that have the ability to make this change and put them in a position that they, oh yes, this makes sense, right? Well, that comes largely down at the opportunities of what you guys do in terms of of your ability to legislate and lobby at the federal level. Where do you see the opportunity, between your organizations and the relationships you've created, on the Hill, as opportunities to, get through the Senate and the House, some motivation to say, hey guys, like, I think we're focusing on the wrong things here from the VA, from the suicide report. Let's start there. Here's what we would like to see and organize around that. Are those conversations happening, or is that out of the realm of possibility?
So one of the things that we are trying to focus on is that period of time right after service, right? That the VFW and DAV run what's called the BDD program, Benefits Delivery at Discharge. It's in the TAP class before people even take off the uniform to make sure they're enrolled in some of these benefits and healthcare within VA. We believe that's a place where we can make incremental gains to make sure that people are set up so that they have a safety net immediately post-service. That's something that we are focusing on. We're trying to expand that. In the past year, VA has agreed to allow those service officers actually to participate in the TAP briefings, so that people can actually enroll, not just learn about the information, but actually begin to enroll on the spot. So ideally, they would, drive out the gate that last time and have their health care and their benefits ready to go. So those are places where, through our efforts at VA, we've gotten that accessibility. We're also working with members of Congress to codify that, to make sure that, nothing is going to prevent veterans from service members, from being able to access those benefits. So that's something that, again, that's our small way of trying to make sure that while those service members, we still have one hand on the steering wheel, we can hopefully guide them towards something that's going to set them up the next year, 10 years from now, whatever it might be. Once you get out, me, for example, it is hard. It really is, especially if you're not tied to, whether it's the VFW, the American Legion, or DAV. It is more difficult. So that's our way of trying to get this as upstream as possible so that, when you're still in service, these things are looking more attractive to you and easier to actually navigate.
Naomi, go back to you. Following on Tim's question, he kind of asked, what can we do, or what can our organizations do that can make an impact on this now? So suggest this idea of a red alert system inside of the VA when someone's running low on their medications. What would that look like from an advocacy perspective? Would that need to be policy changed internally at the VA, or would that be legislated? And do you see a path forward on something like that?
Well, let me say this, not everything needs to be legislated. And, a lot of times we hear that, we'll just put this in a bill. Well, no, that's not always the answer. There are ways that VA can go about doing this, whether it be through technology, they can flag a veteran's record or whatever it is. Not everything needs to be legislated. I'll say, it is it's difficult because when you get down to that point where you look at your meds for the week, because you have so many, you have to actually prepare them for the week. When you look at them and you realize, I'm only down to one, or I don't know if I can make it through the week, and wait for it to be mailed to me, because if you just stop that medication, you will go through withdrawal. And the implications of that alone, not just psychologically, but physically, you can stroke out. I mean, there's so many different things depending on the medication that you're taking, but there's so many different things that can happen. And I think that the idea of flagging someone's record to say, this veteran's medication is getting low, or I still don't understand why there isn't some sort of a way for them to automatically just refill it. And I understand that maybe it might be certain medications, but I've been on this particular medication for at least the last 15 years, let's just say. And it just is this rigmarole every single time. So now, you've prescribed me something, I've become dependent on it. Now I have to, kind of tailor my life and, around this particular medication to make sure that I don't run out, because if I do, I could die, or, it's just all of these different things. So I think potentially doing that, maybe like you said, some sort of a red alert or a flag, or, alert that pharmacist that the veterans running out of their medication. Send a message to the provider. Does this medication need to be renewed?
And I think the VA can do all of those things, Naomi, right? And I'd love to hear you guys, because I want to point out something very clear for everybody that's listening and I'm watching this, is that, we all got to watch the VA do one of the most monumental things it's ever done in its entire existence. And we got to observe it with our own eyes just over the last 2 years. And what they did to get the Pact Act threaded through the organization and into every veteran's home in America was brilliantly done. It was a big marketing plan. They moved the behemoth of this organization in ways that it has never been done before. So if they wanted to truly solve this problem, I point to the marketing budget that we just talked about earlier in this conversation. If they truly wanted to do something about this, they would. But they don't, right? Because the dirty secret is the House controls the spending of the dollar, right? But the VA can spend the dollar how they choose, and they're just choosing not to. And that I think is fundamentally wrong. And that's where I think that we have, as organizations, the best opportunity now, coming in with the new organization of Doug Collins and administration, to really lean as these organizations and be like, listen, guys, we've seen this over and over again. It's over. Let's change the way that we're doing business. Let's change the way that we're reporting out on these things, and let's do what you guys did for the Pact Act, and let's solve suicide within the ranks of the veteran that comes to the VHA for their very care that you guys market for. And I'd love to hear what you guys think, how we can do this when we get to the new administration and the VA that is coming forward. How start with Cole. I'd love to hear you guys what you guys are lining up for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and something a lot of organizations are thinking about is how to work with the new administration, with the people that have been nominated yet to be confirmed, right? A lot of people don't realize that the VA, aside from being the largest healthcare system in the country and probably the world, is also the second largest federal agency in budget and personnel behind the Department of Defense, right? So it's a huge organization that, unlike the Department of Defense, is very decentralized, and the demographic of people that they deal with is much older, have a lot more health issues. There are challenges to delivery for different geographic locations, all sorts of things, right? And even that said, the VA has, I think, the smallest number of political appointees of every government agency in the federal government. So even with change of administration, there's not as much political, I hesitate to use the word power, but power and pressure to be able to implement broad sweeping changes. Now, that being said, the VA does have a lot of authority from central office to, and the White House obviously has a lot of authority through executive orders and agency directives, regulatory changes, that sort of stuff to be able to change things. As it relates to suicide prevention, I think that there are some pretty basic things that could be done. Again, we talked about the culture issue. The VA looking at suicide prevention through the lens of mental health. I think a great step for prioritization and messaging. The VA says suicide prevention is their number one clinical priority. I think it should be their number one overall priority. And I think taking the Office of Suicide Prevention out of the Office of Mental Health, potentially even VHA, making it a direct report to the Secretary, would kind of help unify the effort between VBA and VHA to tackle this problem, number one. I think obviously the new administration, working with Congress to talk about the budgetary challenges and issues in the macro political sense right now. It's a brave new world as we're looking at, I think a lot of fuss has been made about, Doge and budgetary restraints and different reconciliation bills and the way forward on budget for different things. But there definitely will be opportunities to discuss these complex issues with the new administration. Some of it is going to boil down to an individual's history and personal exposure to these issues to understand why it is as important as it is. I think we can lean on members of Congress that have a military background to help message that more effectively. But there's a lot of opportunity for sure.
Pat or Naomi, should the Government Accountability Office be conducting these reports? Pull this outside of the VA and have someone else do it so it's not the VA themselves writing the report on themselves?
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad thought or suggestion at all. This is primarily driven by VHA, and they're going to focus on VHA related things and not think about what else may be a part of this. What I don't love about all of these reports is, they project different numbers out there and leave it up to us to, figure out what the next step should be. First off, VA has so much more information. It's a very frustrating thing that to get them to even include other parts of some of this data. For years, we were just told, yes, they have the data. We just need to ask for it. That's not right? Pat Murray should not have to ask for some of this data and store it on my desktop, right? That's not a proper way to go about this. This is our government, right? All this information should be as readily available as possible. There's nothing top secret about whether it's VHA or VBA participation and usage. What I don't love is there's never nearly enough recommendations for things that I don't ever want to call them successes, because nothing about this is a success, but maybe places where there are being incremental gains being made. It doesn't seem like they ever want to step out and, on their own focus on these things. They're presenting the information and saying, here, you do with it as you will. That's never something that I think is very helpful. It would be fantastic if in this report and all of their actions, they also said we need to do X, Y, or Z more. There are certain things that they have over the years talked about, places where they are seeing positive interactions, such as like the Solid Start program, but there's not enough of that. It would be so much more helpful if there was a lot more information and also some analysis about what we can do with that and what VA can on their own pivot towards, but also say, we need Congress to do this, or we need the administration to do this, or we need veterans organizations like our three organizations. What can we do? The onus is not on us, but we could be a force multiplier everywhere we can. Between DAV, American Legion, VFW, we're in every town and community in this country and even across the world, right? Overseas as well. So that's places that, we want to help. And it seems like we're banging on the door asking, and we're given a report with some stats for Pat Murray or Cole Lyle to figure out on our own and take to Congress and try to make change. Some more, initiative from VA would be, I think, more beneficial.
And I think you're absolutely correct, Pat, is, when 70% of it's 68%, but that number of individuals within the care of the organization are, on a psychotropic medicine of some sort, there has to be more information than just that number alone. Like, that's ridiculous for anybody to sit back and be like, oh, that's a great, thanks for sharing that number without having 10 different follow-on questions.
Well,
right?
Tim, just to interrupt, they didn't put that number out there.
Whoa,
Remember, we put that
understood it,
statistic together along with the 28% prescription rate.
Oh,
And like only a handful of folks actually had their hand on that data. The VA had it, but we're the ones that put that out. So just wanted to point that out.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that's the leading of this all is that private institutions and private organizations like the VFW, the VA, the DAV are doing all this work for the VA, to Pat's point, because they're just giving us these breadcrumbs that we're supposed to be like, oh, I can make sense of these bones, and I'm going to go in this direction. Well, that's just absurd. And
Well, I'll say this too. You talked about it earlier, where women veterans, the number went down by 24.1%, whereas the year before it went up by 24.1%. And, we went back and we were trying to get an answer like, well, why is that? That seems kind of odd. And kind of convenient, but kind of odd. The way it kind of was explained to us was, it could be, it's because of the small sample of women veterans and this and that. Well, you're putting this number out there and leaving it to us. And so, while we hope that's the case, we hope women veterans suicide rate has gone down. I'll say this. From the beginning of them tracking the suicide rate till today, it's actually gone up. If you look at the rate from when they started to track suicides to today, it's actually continuously gone up. Forget about the swings and everything and the ups and downs in between. You got to look at from beginning until today. And so we did a journal review, womenveterans.org, as DAV did a review, and that's our Women Veterans Report. It's called Women Veterans, The Journey to Mental Wellness. And in there, we talk about exactly that, which is there are so many of these gains and, in between, these gains, so to speak, but when really you look at the sum of it all, that's really not the case. And unfortunately, that rate translates to a life lost.
It's insulting, really. It's like an insult of our intelligence, and Well,
I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think our organizations just continue to do what we're doing, continue to stay boots on the ground, continue to beat the drum and do exactly this, continue to have conversations. And, there is a question, am I my brother's keeper?
Absolutely.
Yes. Right?
I appreciate you pointing that out, Naomi, because I don't know if Tim mentioned it earlier, but I went to our good old Chat GPT and asked what are the probability of a 24.1% increase over 1 year and then a 24.1% decrease the very next year. It's like 1 in 15 billion or so. I'm rounding down by about 900 million. So I guess what would you say for next steps as we go forward? Say if there were to be a message to Doug Collins as he assumes role hopefully after the successful confirmation on the 21st, what would the ask be from you as a veteran?
Yeah, I think two things. My biggest message here is there needs to be a reinvigorated sense of urgency for this problem. When you go and you talk about veteran suicide, in the United States, anywhere you go and you talk with veterans, this is one of the few issues that gets them just very viscerally angry because they've had to deal with this with friends and family members that they served with or that they know. And there seems to be to them a lack of urgency. Like they all say we should be throwing everything we can at this problem because it's a black stain, on our country that this isn't getting better and is in fact getting worse. So that would be my number one thing. And I think there's some, things that any incoming secretary could do to make changes and kind of reinvigorate that sense of urgency. But from a policy perspective, I think, again, I know right now there's a conversation more broadly happening about, VA dollars going to community providers and community organizations. But I think the Fox Grant program is a great program that is really designed to get to the upstream problems. I think the program itself needs a little bit of fine tuning to make sure that the organizations that the money is going to are the local people on the ground that are doing good work. But that's a very small percentage of the VA's budget, and I think it does a lot of good in terms of the outreach and then the actual work being done on the ground to assist this problem.
Thanks, Cole. Naomi?
So I think, as whoever the new secretary is going to be, I think they need to take a good look at exactly this, make this the number one priority overall, as was mentioned, not just the number one clinical priority, but the number one priority, and really look at what is seen as gold standards. Look at these other, maybe healthcare systems. We have the largest healthcare system in the world, and that understandably so. But there are smaller other populations that can be looked at that might help, such as looking at the rural communities, looking at underserved populations, looking at minority populations, and making sure that these areas are being reached in every aspect. As Pat mentioned, ensuring that there is housing security, that there is no food insecurity, and homelessness is real, and not just homelessness, but underhoused, and that could be a whole other topic that I could go into now. But really taking a look at what has been done, particularly in the last several years, and because the number of women veterans also is growing and continues to grow. And we are the fastest growing population. And so I think that, when I talk about the underserved population, I'm also speaking about that demographic and ensuring that women veterans have what they need, and find out what's going on with that 24.1% number, because that is such a head scratcher for me.
Thank you very much, Naomi.
Pat, one question I wanted to ask you, right, is the Grunstyle Foundation and the VFW have partnered this year on a lot of your legislative issues that speak to exactly this topic that we're talking about. So, we are really grateful to partner up on this and amplify this messaging. What say you? Where do you see your organization steering the conversation and working as this larger team to address these bigger issues?
Sure. So, what I'd really like to do, I guess, if Doug Collins is listening, hopefully a fan of the Gaslighting the Warfighter podcast, but if he's listening, stop listening to the system. If he understands it's a problem, right? He has to know this stuff, that this is an issue. Don't go ask the system, how's the system doing? Because the system's likely going to say the system's doing it right. We kind of want to break that. Be kind of a change agent. That's what I would urge him to do. And it doesn't necessarily need to be, listen to Pat Murray or the VFW or the American Legion or DAV, but you got to not rely on the system to tell you how's the system doing. That's maybe the biggest thing I would urge him to do. Think about some outside the box, maybe solutions, ideas. There's money to be used for this. The Staff Sergeant Fox grants were a great way to take that and pivot and try something else. Let's do more like that. That's what I would push for. I know that we've talked about a lot of things, Tim and Derek, with different grunt style things. One of the things we're really going to focus on is alternate therapies, right? So whether it's plant-based therapies, psychedelics, things like that, let's find out what works, because the traditional modalities, whether it's sitting knee to knee with someone and talking about them, or pharmacy solutions, right? That is what we've relied on for far too long as the solution for some of these things. Let's get innovative. Let's think about different ways that we can maybe get ahead of this, try something different. We've heard plenty of times over the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again, expecting different results. That's what the biggest thing I would push is, please, let's try anything different. What works for some of these folks, let's keep it going. But if it's not working for everybody, let's find ways to kind of plug those holes.
Thanks, Pat. Cole, thanks a lot for being here today. Do you have any parting comments for us as we depart?
I would say that, the American Legion has a national program called Be the One that seeks to destigmatize conversations around mental health and encourage peer-to-peer support. I would say to a veteran listening that is struggling with just everyday life things, like I said, relationship, financial stress, things like that, really lean on your people, your friends, family, veteran peer support. It's not hard to have a difficult conversation. You just have to have it. As the program alludes to, be the one that helps stop somebody from making that decision, and be the one to stay if that's you.
Thanks, Cole. Pat?
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Tim, and everybody else. The biggest thing, if anybody's listening, if you encounter a hurdle, right, whether it's with the VA, we've all heard stories, tons of folks, may go there and not get the desired outcome they're looking for. Please don't give up. Whether that's go back to them, try somewhere else, try somewhere in the community. There's a ton of great resources that are out there. Please don't just, put your head down, get discouraged, get demoralized. Please just keep pushing forward. If any of these things ever, you're ever encountering any of these feelings, please, you are not alone. That's the biggest message. Don't give up. You're not alone. Keep charging forward. And, hopefully, a year from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we won't ever have to have this conversation again, because, we've gotten ahead of this and hopefully get down to zero.
Thanks a lot, Pat. Naomi?
As someone that has dealt with suicidal ideations, I will also make that plea to someone. If you feel like your head is not above water, you feel like you're just not going to climb out of this hole that you're in, there is help. You have heard us talk about the crisis line 988. Press 1 for the veteran option. You've heard things here about VA. It's not all doom and gloom. I trust me when I tell you there is light at the other end. Trust me, please. And I really am, DAV is here for you, and turn to your fellow brothers and sisters if possible. If not, just please reach out to someone and just let them know, hey, I need help. And those are the hardest words, the hardest 3 words that you might ever have to utter, but it is important, and your very life could depend on it.
Thanks, Naomi.
All right, I want to thank Patrick, Naomi, Cole for your contributions to the show. We're certainly talking about some heavy subject matter, but what I want to thank you the most for are, for anybody that's watching, these are 3 individuals that raised their hand. They got into the fight. That is anybody listening. You can get into this conversation as well. You can go to any one of these organizations and get involved and be a member and be a force of change. That is what we are driving for here, is to get you off the sideline, get into the conversation, raise your hand, be counted, and get involved. That's all I want. That's all we all want, right, is to make a better outcome for our community, because we have worked very hard in previous lives, and we need to be able to set the table for the next generation that's going to raise their hand to defend this beautiful country that we served our time in doing so honorably and boldly. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and I want to thank these organizations for showing up and being involved and creating opportunities for others.
When we come back, we're going to be joined by the chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. We're going to be discussing all the critical issues we covered today, the role of the chairman and oversight of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and where we need to go for the future. Stay tuned.
Grunstyle Foundation Deployment is a drive-through food and household item distribution event. We target 650 junior enlisted active duty soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen with families. And we try to give them about a month's worth of groceries and all those household items that a family with children may need in order to thrive.
For me, it's just joy being able to have the opportunity to support and give back to the community. Grunstyle Foundation aligns with the Air Force core value of service before self in providing services to family members in need.
Welcome back to Gaslighting the Warfighter. We are honored, my friends, to share the program with Congressman Mike Bost. He is the ranking member of the House Veteran Affairs Committee. He is joining us today as a veteran, as well as an individual that is largely trying to solve this problem from his position, from inside the HVAC, as well as his influences inside of Congress. So I want to welcome to the program, Congressman. Thank you for joining us today in this important conversation, and we have a lot to talk about.
Well, thank you. And, the main reason that people that know me know how passionate I am about my position as chairman of the VA. My dad and his brothers were all Army. My grandfather, the one grandfather I didn't know, Second World War Navy. The grandfather I did know on the side was a Marine, Korean War veteran. An uncle who was a Marine that was a victim of the ultimate oxymoron, friendly fire. He lived, and he has had a very successful life thanks to the VA. I was a Marine Corps corporal. I was an electronic specialist, radar repairman during peacetime. My son is a lieutenant colonel today. He is a JAG, and he is now a reservist. He was active for many years. And then my grandson, not his child, but my daughter's child, he just got out of the Corps. He was a corporal when he got out. He was an F-18 mechanic. So you can say it's kind of personal to me.
Absolutely. Semper Fi.
Semper Fi.
So we're proud to have you here, Chairman Bost. We've been having this conversation about medications, overprescribing, talking about the VA's annual suicide report. We met earlier last year and we had a discussion. You became very impassioned about this topic. And Tim Jensen, myself, the veterans community as a whole are grateful for that, as many of us have been overprescribed ourselves or had a bad experience with one of these treatments. And it's not to say all drugs are bad, but there's some issues going on. And we've had panels with the VFW, American Legion, DAV, a series of organizations, all who have resolutions on the books calling for action as it relates to this issue for informed consent, reform deprescribing guidelines, safer practices as a whole, and for the VA to share more information for the public and Congress as it relates to prescribing and veteran suicides. Are you surprised at all? Were you surprised when you learned about the 68% prescription rate at the VHA for all veterans who are treated there of psychiatric drugs, and 28% prescription rate of antidepressants for veterans under care of the VHA?
Yeah, I felt that I'm not really surprised by those numbers, but when they came out, and this is everything besides opioids. You remember when the opioid situation, and we worked so hard to get off because it doesn't cure the problem; it numbs the problem, and we need to. When a lot of our veterans, when they leave the military. Sometimes it isn't the things that happen in the military, it's the sudden drop-off of not being in a coordinated setup. And so when we look at mental health issues with our veterans, we're not winning the game. And the reason we're not winning the game is because you're trying the same old thing over and over again, and here, take a pill, you'll be great. No, you don't. You take a pill and it's not dealing with the true base problem. And so in answer to your question, it doesn't surprise me, because that doesn't mean there aren't some good employees at VA. Don't mean that. But the docs, all of a sudden, if they get a routine and says, hey, I treated this person over here like this, I know I can give them this medicine, and just keep them on it, and then I'll be done with this and I'll move on. That's not what they need. They need long time, and we're not winning the game. You know, the numbers for suicide, they changed. They went from 21 to 17, but I think those numbers are counted wrong. And that's because everything isn't always reported as a suicide that is a suicide. You know, the stigma that goes with the family, okay, I drove my car off a cliff, whatever, then that's not being reported well. The reporting factor that the VA that you're asking for is something we need to get. I hope with the new secretary we can, because the answer is not putting somebody on drugs and leaving them on drugs forever. The answer is finding out what their situation was that caused them to go into the state of mental health, okay? And it's not a one size fits all. So we need to know the person. And, you know, another issue that's dealt with it with the mental health is, look, our veteran homeless rate. Quite often when we're dealing with homeless veterans, we've got to really study, did that veteran become homeless because of poor money management? Did he or she become homeless because of a mental issue? Or did he or she become homeless because she got involved with drugs? Are they now involved with drugs because of the other issues? And so, you know, and we're trying to work with VA to have programs that are focused on getting people cured.
Yes, sir. You're looking at one veteran that became homeless after being prescribed a drug cocktail of meds by the VA. So there's one statistic right there.
And unless the VA can come to you while you're homeless and then figure out what your need is, what got you there in the first place, get that straightened out, get you back where you're back an active part of society, working, but dealing with the mental health issue in the right way, not, you know, searching for the next thing to numb you out.
Yes, sir.
Chairman Bost, you know, the relationship that the VA has created over the years with these prescriptions and the strategies that they've been using to deploy them within the veteran space has been, you know, rather interesting to watch, right? We've seen connections with agencies and developers like Ricketts and Coleman or Endeavor, who they became to be, that have used the VA as a testing ground for their opioids and opioid abatement drugs, and have created a large opioid problem, as we've seen in the early 90s. Now, you know, and then we're seeing some of this very similar things that are happening with the relationships they have today with Trazodone and Zoloft and these other readily accessible drugs that they seem to just pass out like candy at the VA. What are we doing to be, you know, from an investigative aspect or a regulatory aspect that is looking at some of these relationships to understand, like, what is the relationship there that is creating these behaviors?
Right. That's where our oversight should get involved. Okay, but we have to have a VA that's open to allow us to truly get their true numbers. Where are the areas where they're prescribing more? What VA facility prescribes the most? What is the key drug? What's the tie between the manufacturer of that drug and the VA facility? All of these things are things we've got to look at, but we've also got to have a VA that will be open with us. Remember, we've spent the last 4 years, well, actually the last 2 years on our side, because we couldn't get anything done from the request for the first 2 years, but trying to request information and it never comes. And you can even put it in a law and say it has to be done on a certain date. And so many of the people at the VA think that the law is a suggestion, not fact. And so that's a whole lot of us having to do our job of oversight.
How does it got so politicized inside of the system? That,
you know, here's what I told the secretary that's there now. Okay, and I've known him for quite some time. And there was a problem that we had a public hearing on, and it was dealing with the fact that that they had paid bonuses to the higher executives when the bonuses were supposed to go to the doctors, the nurses, all of this, but they paid these real high bonuses and then they got caught. When he came to try to defend them and did not fire them, I said, here's what I want you to know, Mr. Secretary. The deep state is real. The employees that you're dealing with know that if they just wait it out, I may not be elected anymore, and then they can move on and they can keep doing what they're doing, and then we're not in their way. But then I also looked at him and I said, but I've only been here 10 years and I've seen 5 of you. So they do the same thing to them. That's the problem we have to cure. We need to take back control, understand, look, it's like I said right off the start. The VA was not created for the bureaucrats at VA. The VA is created for the veterans. And the only way that you can do the veterans right, not only in this instance, but everything else, is know what's happening, know what our veterans need, and deliver in a way that truly deals with whatever their issue was. Remember, DOD's job is to go out and fight our wars, okay? Our job is try to fix what they break to the best of our ability. And that can be with with wounds that you can see and wounds that you can't see. And we got some of the best docs in the VA. We just got to get them focused. And we can only do that when we do the oversight like we're talking about here. Doing the monitoring, know how many of these drugs they're issuing out. Why did they start issuing them out? What's the long-term effects? All of these things is what we need to do, and need to bring the experts from there to us to talk, but also have accurate numbers on the distribution and how many people are prescribing.
I've seen some of the interaction between your office and the VA and how those responses go. I'm glad to know that it's not just me and the Grunstyle Foundation that get gaslit. Unfortunate to see that it's Congress and the House Veterans Affairs Committee receiving that same response, unfortunately.
We've had to, for the first time in about 8 years, this last year, we've had to subpoena them twice. Now, unfortunately, even with the subpoena, they ignore it, because if you violate a subpoena, it's up to the legal office of jurisdiction, which ends up being DC's attorney, and they don't prosecute them. So, but it does get on public record that we've subpoenaed them. Now, like I said, I don't think I'm going to have that with the next secretary, but the secretary will also have to know that he has underlings that can keep this information from him unless he keeps dead straddle of him, and I believe Doug will.
In 2010, the House Veterans Affairs Committee held hearings titled Exploring the Relationship Between Medications and Veteran Suicides. Today, the Grunstyle Foundation, we've been hosting summits across the country that are named of the same name of this 2010 House Vets Affairs Committee hearing. And we've been bringing experts, we've been bringing in folks who have got these lived experiences. We've got a veteran who took his life after being in Wellbutrin for 8 days, had no mental health condition going in, was in there for a foot injury and a eye test. And they screened him for depression and tested positive for moderate depression.
And gave him a drug that actually put him over the edge.
He wasn't even on the edge. This kid was a student veteran at Montana Tech, and he was excelling in life. He was excited about the future ahead of him. He was not suicidal at all. And 8 days later, after a prescription, he's gone. And so we've been looking at these conversations. We've been having these experts come forward, and we've been finding 3.5 times increased risk of suicide for those prescribed antidepressants, 2.4, 2.6 increased risk for attempts of suicide. We've got all these stories, just this countless parade of horror stories. The question I'd like to ask is, we had these hearings in 2010. Do you feel like today, 14 years later, 15 years later, do you feel like we're in this place where we need to re-explore this issue?
I think we should re-explore it. I think we're in a better place than we were with opioids, but now it's a different drugs, okay? Opioids were the one that everybody raised the red flags on, and it was not only at VA, it was everywhere, overprescribing. Now, the question, I would love to have a hearing because on stuff like this, one thing is, this is what you're checking out, and we're talking about veterans right now, but what do we know about the drugs that they're prescribing for people who are not veterans? Does it get the same effect? And is it the drug that is putting them there, or is it some other factor involved? And your research and your conversation with others is a tremendous help to us. And so, yes, I would love to try to reach back out and figure out, okay, we're not opioids, but it's this type of drug.
Yes, sir. We'd be proud to support you in any way we can. We've had a lot of allies coming forward, VFW, DV, American Legion, Jewish War Vets, VVA, down the list of all past resolutions calling for actions as it relates to this issue. And we're just excited where we're at today because this has gone on for so many years. And every day that goes by is another unnecessary tragedy had the patient been properly informed of the risks of the medications they were prescribed.
And that's a whole lot of the, another issue we've got out there, though, is so many of the people that we lose, veterans that we lose to suicide, do not know what's available to them at the VA, or their first experience out of the military with the VA was not a good one, and they would rather go anywhere but. And that's real scary.
Absolutely. Now, Chairman, you mentioned your excitement, the potential of Doug Collins coming online as the next Secretary of the VA, and I think there is a lot of excitement, to that possibility. I'm curious to know from the Chairman's position, what are some of the things that you would expect to see within the first 90 to 120 days of opportunity that is addressing suicide, addressing some of these overprescribing?
Yeah, that can be worked on. There's no problem there. But some of the key issues, one, because suicide is always what we're trying to stop. Another one is to make sure that the Mission Act, which is the act that allows the veteran to make a choice to not wait on VA, but actually go out in the community and receive some help, regardless of what that issue is. And quite often, they're so far away from a VA. But unfortunately, we've got several people in and throughout this nation and the world while trying to implement the Mission Act. If you're in one visit area, maybe they're doing it fairly well, but you're in another one and they're not doing it right at all. And we've got to go have oversight for that. At the same time, when we're going to our community care and things like that, remember, we passed the Elizabeth Dole Act, but then I and our committee has to hold the feet to the fire of the VA. Like I said, a lot easier now because it is a friendly group that we work with over there now with Doug going in. But making sure the Dole Act is not it's not an easy piece of legislation either. So now you've got two large pieces of it, well, three, because you've got the Mission Act, you've got the Pact Act, and now you're going to have the Dole Act. All of them being implemented at a time when we're trying to get these services, and we've got to make sure that we're doing it right. And I'll tell you another issue that I'm going to be working on, and I don't know if you all have talked about it or not, and I've been dealing with this ever since I came to Congress. I did not realize that this was the case. See, if you go to the VA and you ask for, you get assigned a fiduciary. I don't know if you know this or not. You get assigned a fiduciary, automatic, because of the way their attorneys interpreted the Brady Bill from 35 years ago. You lose your Second Amendment rights. No due process, you lose them. So what we did was we used the budget and some of that to get it stopped for this last year. But we've got to make it permanent because another administration will come in. Hey, look, if a person is a danger to themselves or to others, there's a process. The same way a person that never served in the military goes through that process. But why in the world should the people who actually fought to keep our constitutional rights have a constitutional right taken away without due process just because they're a veteran who needs help? that's a bill that I'll be working on, and I have been working on. And I got so many of the left that tell me, oh, no, but you're just going to have more. No, you're not. No, you're not. The same thing happens in the civilian or non-military world. If a family member is a danger to themselves or others, there is a reporting process based on each state. That then fires up the judge to give a ruling on whether that's the case or not. Our veterans haven't had that for 35 years.
Sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, the due process is absolutely.
And I'll tell you another problem that comes with that. Maybe not on the East Coast, maybe not on the West Coast, but in flyover country where I live, there's certain veterans that will say, you know what, I heard that I could lose my Second Amendment rights if I use the VA, and I'm not going to use the VA. That's not good. We want every veteran to use the services that are available to them, and then we need to make sure that those services are the best services that they can have.
It's interesting you're talking about concerns about Second Amendment rights and these issues, especially when it comes to violence. And we're talking about veteran suicides, but we're starting to look at also what's going on with medications and violence. And this is not a very well kept secret here, but nobody's really talking about it or addressing it in a meaningful way. So again, we're very excited to have these conversations with you, incoming VA Secretary, and whatever we can do to support you and your team. We understand you have hearings coming up in late February. If there's any way we can support you or help you with those, we'd be honored to.
And I'm going to tell you, our staff is on board, and I've got one of the best staffs on the Hill. I really do, and everybody knows it. And they know their veterans and know their veterans' issues, and are trying to make every day better for our veterans.
We're proud of you working with them.
Absolutely, Chairman. We want to say thank you for your time and the continued contributions to our country, both in uniform and as a legislative member.
Well, this corporal never thought he'd have a position of being the chairman of the VA committee, but somehow God's blessed me, and it's a blessing to work for all of our veterans.
There you go. And you represent it well, and you still have that Marine Corps grit, which I appreciate as a former Marine myself.
Simplify.
All right, my friends, that's it for Gaslighting the Warfighter. Now, we've covered a lot of great information here, my friends. It's time to get involved. Find your local representative, find ways of getting involved, get in with the VFW, the American Legion, the DAV, IAVA. The horizon is vast, but it ain't going to start until you take that first step and you get into the fight, because we need you, and we need you now more than ever, because we have a viable chance to make a significant change in the way that we address suicide, the way that we address mental health and over-prescribing or the use of psychotropic medicines within our community. And hopefully there are some substantial learnings that we can take from this that we can apply to the larger part of this country that needs this desperately as well. So that is the charge, that is the mission, and that is what we're here to do. And I want to say thank you again to the chairman and all of the guests for this specific episodes of Gaslighting the Warfighter. Until next time, we'll see you then.
This has been Gaslighting the Warfighter. The Grunstyle Foundation continues fighting for those who have served. Support our mission at grunstylefoundation.org/donate. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and keep moving forward with purpose.